The sky above Earth was on fire. Columns of flame rained down from orbit, reducing cities to molten wastelands. The Zalvar, self-proclaimed rulers of the Orion Arm, had come in full force, their war fleets blotting out the stars. Their towering, insectoid war machines stalked the streets, incinerating any remnants of resistance. The Earth's militaries, once the pinnacle of human strength, had been reduced to scattered remnants. The invasion had not been a battle, it had been a slaughter. Among the ruins of New York, General Eric Vasquez lay against a pile of rubble, gripping his shattered arm. He had fought until his ammunition ran dry, until the last of his men fell around him. Now, he could only watch as the Zalvar soldiers moved methodically through the streets, rounding up human survivors for transport to the orbiting slave ships. He gritted his teeth. Better to die than to serve them. Then the scream came. It was high-pitched, inhuman, and wrong. Vasquez turned his head just in time to see a Zalvar soldier convulsing, its elongated, chitinous arms twitching violently. A blackish-green bile oozed from its mandibles before it collapsed, twitching, shuddering. And then, impossibly, it rose again. But something had changed. Its red eyes had turned milky white. Its mandibles twitched, no longer with purpose, but with hunger. And then it lunged at its fellow soldiers, tearing into their carapace armor with unnatural strength. The other Zalvar let out a series of screeching commands, only for their fallen comrade to tear through them with terrifying ease. It spread quickly. Across the city, across the continent, across the planet, wherever the Zalvar had landed, the infection took root. What had once been a calculated planetary invasion was now a battlefield of chaos. The bioweapon the Zalvar had deployed to weaken Earth's defenses had mutated beyond their control. It had been meant to cause weakness, to subdue the population for easy conquest. Instead, it had reanimated the dead. And now, those dead were coming for them. In the command vessel orbiting Earth, Grand Marshal Zethos watched the carnage unfolding below with growing horror. His clawed fingers twitched at the holographic projections. The human population had been pacified, their cities reduced to rubble, yet his forces were being slaughtered, not by the humans, but by something else. "This is impossible," Zethos snarled, mandibles clicking in frustration. "How can a dead thing fight?" A technician, his armor dented from an earlier riot, trembled as he spoke. The pathogen we deployed, Supreme One. It has evolved. It does not merely kill its hosts. It reanimates them." Zethos turned his burning gaze upon the technician, who shrank under his scrutiny. "Contain it," Zethos ordered coldly. "Incinerate all infected zones. Wipe them from the surface." The orders were followed immediately. Within moments, fire rained from the sky once more, not to conquer, but to purge. Entire districts were erased in thermonuclear explosions. The Zalvar commanders did not discriminate. Human or infected, it did not matter. But it was too late. The infection was already aboard their ships. On the lower decks of the command vessel, where captured human prisoners had been stored, a guard barely had time to react before the first infected lunged at him. It had been a woman once, her tattered clothing suggested she had been a civilian, but her eyes were clouded, her jaw unhinged unnaturally. She moved faster than anything he had seen before, clawing through his armor like paper. Screams erupted throughout the ship as the infection spread. Panic overtook protocol. Soldiers abandoned their posts. The high-ranking officials sealed themselves within the bridge, leaving the lower decks to fend for themselves. But it didn't matter. The infection moved faster than any evacuation plan. Within the hour, the ship was lost. On the surface, General Vasquez stood upon the crumbling remains of a Zalvar war machine, watching the sky. The once mighty fleet that had conquered Earth was now in chaos. Ships collided as their infected crews turned on one another. Escape pods fired randomly into space, only to be hunted down by swarms of infected Zalvar. Earth was no longer theirs. Vasquez felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The bastards had come to enslave his planet, only to become the first casualties of their own weapon. He looked around at the devastation, at the mindless hordes shambling in the streets, at the broken world he had once sworn to protect. This was no victory. It was the beginning of something worse. Far above, beyond Earth's orbit, the infection was already spreading. And the galaxy had no idea what was coming. Grand Marshal Zethos stood motionless, his clawed fingers digging into the armrests of his command throne. The bridge of his warship, the Tyrants' Fong, had been fortified, sealed from the chaos consuming the rest of the vessel. The screams of his soldiers echoed through the comm channels. Every attempt to contain the infection had failed. His elite guards, armed with plasma lances, stood tense around him, their multifaceted eyes darting between the sealed doors and the flickering tactical displays. The fleet was in disarray. Warships collided, their pilots infected. Frigate-class vessels plummeted into Earth's atmosphere, unable to maintain control. This was not an invasion. It was an extinction event. Zethos turned his cold gaze toward the nearest officer. Status of the containment protocols? The officer hesitated, a dangerous mistake in the presence of the supreme commander of the Zalvar Empire. Containment has failed, my lord. The infection spreads faster than projected. Those who fall to it rise within minutes, sometimes seconds. Zethos exhaled a slow, furious breath. Deploy the fleet's incendiary weaponry. Burn them out. Every infected warship must be destroyed. My lord, another officer spoke, trembling, that will cripple our forces. If we lose these ships, we will not be able to hold the Empire's front lines against the Sarkin rebels. A snarl rippled through Zethos's mandibles. If we fail to act, we will have no Empire to defend. He turned to his tactical display, watching in growing horror as the infection spread beyond Earth. Several warships had initiated emergency jumps before succumbing to the horde. That meant one thing: the infection was no longer confined to Earth. It was moving across the stars. Aboard the Zalvar battleship Dominator, Captain Vresh had been a soldier for 40 cycles. He had fought against rogue colonies, executed planetary purges, and crushed rebellions without hesitation. But nothing had prepared him for this. His ship, Dominator, had been part of the second wave of the invasion fleet. They had remained in orbit, awaiting orders. Now, his once pristine battleship had turned into a slaughterhouse. It had started with the wounded. Soldiers returning from the surface, some with minor injuries, others near death, were sent to the med bays. Then the screaming started. Now, the med bays were silent. Because everyone inside was dead. And worse, they weren't staying dead. Vresh had sealed himself in the command center with his most loyal officers. The rest of the ship had become a war zone. The infected weren't just Zalvar anymore. The human prisoners they had taken from Earth had turned as well, their physiology adapting to the virus faster than anticipated. Some of them had mutated, becoming faster, stronger. One of them, what had once been a human soldier, had torn through an entire squad of Zalvar shock troopers in seconds. Vresh had barely escaped with his life. Now, there was only one choice left. He turned to his remaining officers. Activate the ship's self-destruct. The crew hesitated. One of his lieutenants, a younger Zalvar, twitched nervously. Captain, if we do that. Vresh slammed his fist onto the control panel. If we do not, this ship will become a plague carrier. Do it. Before the order could be executed, a deep thud echoed through the chamber. The crew froze. Another thud. Then another. Something was outside the door. Vresh exchanged a tense glance with his second-in-command, before drawing his energy blade. He motioned for 2 guards to stand ready. The metal groaned. A loud, piercing shriek split the silence. The doors buckled inward as a blackened, clawed arm punched through the reinforced alloy. The crew fell back in horror as a hulking, mutated figure forced its way through. It had once been a human soldier. Now, it was something else. Its bones jutted at unnatural angles, its skin was blackened and hardened, as if burned but unbroken. Its mouth had split open wider than any human jaw should, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. And it moved fast. Before anyone could react, it was inside. The first guard was ripped in half. The second fired a pulse rifle, but the creature ignored it. It learned. Adapted. Within seconds, it was on him, sinking its teeth into his throat. Panic erupted. Officers scrambled for weapons, but it was too late. Captain Vresh stood his ground, gripping his blade as the monster turned toward him. He knew, in that moment, that this was no ordinary infection. This was an evolution. And it would not stop here. With a snarl, he lunged at the beast, only for it to lash out with impossible speed. The last thing Vresh saw was its gaping maw, before everything went black. Zalvar Prime, the imperial capital. The High Council of the Zalvar Empire sat in silence. The great warlords, who had once commanded entire fleets with absolute power, now stared at the horrifying reports before them. The Earth invasion had failed. Worse, the infection had spread to multiple ships. Some had jumped into deep space, others had fled to Zalvar-controlled colonies before going dark. The infection was no longer contained. It was spreading. The humans, one of the warlords whispered. They were meant to be conquered. Instead, they have become this. A heavy silence fell. Then the Supreme Chancellor spoke. Burn our colonies, he commanded coldly. No exceptions. No survivors. A stunned silence. Then murmurs of dissent. My lord, if we do that. Do you wish to suffer the same fate? The Chancellor snapped. This is no longer a war. This is an extermination. We must erase this plague before it consumes us all. As the orders were given, as entire planets prepared for purges, the first infected ships entered Zalvar space. It was too late. The Horde was already here. The colony world of Dravis IV had once been a shining jewel of the Zalvar Empire. Nestled in the habitable zone of a red dwarf star, it was a lush, thriving trade hub. Millions of Zalvar citizens lived here, unaware of the nightmare unfolding beyond their skies. That ignorance lasted exactly 7 hours. The first infected ship, a damaged Zalvar frigate, arrived in orbit without warning. Its communications were silent. Automated docking systems attempted to hail the vessel, no response. The planetary governor, Chancellor Zyroth, ordered standard security protocols: scan the ship, send a boarding party. That was the first mistake. Dravis IV Orbital Station, Docking Bay 17. Senior Security Officer Vektar had seen his share of emergencies, rogue pirates, engine malfunctions, even the occasional outbreak of genetic plagues in overpopulated slums. But this? This was something different. His team boarded the drifting warship with caution. The moment they stepped inside, the stench hit them. Something rancid, rotting. The air was humid, thick with the scent of decomposing biomass. It smelled like death. Weapons raised, they moved forward, sweeping the corridors. The lights flickered. The walls were slick with something black and organic. And then they saw them. The bodies of Zalvar soldiers littered the floor, torn apart, disemboweled, half consumed. By the gods, one of Vektar's men whispered. Then a gurgling growl echoed from the darkness. The first infected lunged from the shadows. Vektar barely had time to react before the thing was on him. Its body was twisted, its carapace cracked and pulsing with veins of black infection. Its eyes, once a brilliant crimson, had turned milky white. His plasma rifle barked once, the shot tearing into the creature's abdomen, but it didn't stop. The thing tackled him, its claws digging into his armor, its mandibles snapping wildly. Vector kicked it back, but more were coming. Dozens of them. A horde. Gunfire erupted. His men fought, but for every infected they cut down, 2 more took its place. Vector realized, with growing horror, that they were already dead. And the infection was heading for the planet below. Dravis, 4, planetary capital, Xylos City. Governor Xyroth had never felt fear before. As a member of the ruling caste, he had always been above such emotions. The Empire was eternal. The Empire was order. But as he stood in the planetary command center, staring at the live surveillance feeds, fear took hold. The orbital station had gone dark. Then, an hour later, the bodies started falling from the sky. At first, it seemed like debris, chunks of metal, escape pods that had burned up on re-entry. But then the reports came in, creatures were landing in the streets. Survivors? No. They were hungry. It spread like wildfire. The planetary defense forces responded within minutes, engaging the infected with everything they had. Plasma turrets lined the capital's perimeter, reducing hordes to ash. Gunships strafed the streets, obliterating anything that moved. But it wasn't enough. The infection didn't just kill its victims. It transformed them. Within minutes, fallen soldiers rose again, faster, stronger, more violent. And then came the mutations. Reports flooded in, civilians morphing into grotesque horrors, their bodies warping into nightmarish shapes. Some developed elongated claws, capable of slicing through armor. Others became massive, their bodies swollen with biomass, exploding in showers of infectious bile. Xyroth clutched his skull, his mandibles clicking in panic. Deploy the orbital bombardment. Purge the city before it spreads. An officer hesitated. Sir, there are still millions of uninfected. I said purge it. A desperate command. A final act of cowardice. The sky ignited as the first antimatter warheads struck the surface. Xylos City, the heart of the colony, ceased to exist. The explosions tore through buildings, vaporizing everything in their wake. Firestorms engulfed entire districts. Millions died instantly. For a brief moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over. Then the unthinkable happened. The fire didn't kill them. From the burning ruins, shapes began to move. The infected rose, their bodies charred, but still alive. Some had changed further, becoming resistant to fire itself. Their flesh was blackened, hardened, their movements even faster. The bombardment had only made them stronger. Xyroth's last sight before the feed cut out was his city, his world, being consumed. Dravis, 4 was lost. Across the galaxy. Dravis, 4 was only the first. As the Zalvar tried to contain the infection, more ships, already contaminated, had unknowingly carried the plague to new worlds. Within weeks. Talones, 9, a fortress world, fell within 2 days. Velzan, a major Zalvar colony, was overrun before reinforcements could arrive. The grand trading hub of Vorasha, one of the wealthiest space stations in the Empire, became a floating tomb. The infection was unstoppable. Panic spread through the Zalvar Empire. Worlds were quarantined, but it didn't matter. It was already too late. Entire fleets burned their own colonies, but every time they thought they had contained it, another world fell. And then, the worst news came. A refugee convoy, fleeing from the infected sectors, had crossed into enemy space. The Sarkin Confederacy, sworn rivals of the Zalvar, had unknowingly taken them in. The war between the two empires had lasted for centuries. Now, it didn't matter. The infection had jumped species. The Zalvar were no longer the only ones infected. The entire galaxy was now at risk. The chamber was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of mandibles as the Empire's highest warlords struggled to comprehend the impossible. Maps and tactical displays flickered in front of them, showing red zones expanding across the galaxy. The infection had reached over 24 worlds. Entire fleets had gone dark. Refugee ships had spread the plague beyond the Empire's borders. Grand Marshal Zethos sat at the head of the council table, his claws digging into the metal. His cold, calculating mind struggled to grasp the reality of their situation. The Zalvar Empire had waged countless wars across the stars, but this was different. They weren't fighting an enemy. They were fighting the end of everything. A warlord slammed his fist onto the table. We must abandon the outer colonies. Consolidate our forces in the inner systems and... Fool, snapped another. If we retreat, the infection will follow. We need to purge every compromised world. No exceptions. Zethos remained silent, watching the debate unravel into chaos. Burning worlds wouldn't stop this. They had already tried. Dravis 4, Telones 9, Velzan, entire planets had been reduced to ashes, but the infected kept coming. They were adapting. A grim realization settled over him. This was no ordinary virus. This was a war machine. And then, a transmission cut through the noise. The hologram of a Zalvar intelligence officer flickered into existence. His usually composed expression was twisted in barely restrained panic. "My lords," the officer began, his voice trembling. "We have intercepted a distress signal, from the Sarkin Confederacy." The chamber froze. The Sarkin Confederacy, the Zalvar's oldest and most powerful enemy. For centuries, the two empires had fought for dominance over the galaxy. Now, their sworn foes were sending out a desperate plea for aid. Zethos leaned forward. "Play it." The hologram shifted. The screen crackled with static, then displayed a Sarkin officer. His armor was torn, his reptilian skin covered in wounds. The screams of his soldiers echoed in the background. "This is General Reichel of the Sarkin Home Fleet," he gasped, blood dripping from his fanged mouth. "To any remaining forces, do not respond to refugee ships. Do not let them land. We took them in. We tried to help." He shuddered, turning his head towards something off-screen. "By the gods, we didn't know." The feed glitched, cutting to fragmented images. A Sarkin battleship, overrun with twisted, clawed figures. A planetary capital, engulfed in flames. A new horror, Sarkins, once proud warriors, now infected, their bodies reshaped into terrifying new forms. Then, the final image, General Reichel, his eyes clouded, his skin blackened with the infection. The message ended. Silence fell over the chamber. Then, one of the warlords finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of true fear. "The infection has spread beyond us." The Zalvar had assumed that their biology made them the only targets. But now, it was clear. The virus was indiscriminate. It did not care about politics, species, or borders. It only cared about spreading. Zethos stood. His voice, once commanding, now held a dangerous edge. "The war is over." Gasps echoed across the chamber. "Over," one of the warlords hissed. "We are still the Zalvar Empire. We can." "No," Zethos interrupted. His crimson eyes glowed with cold certainty. "We are no longer fighting for power. We are fighting for survival." For the first time in the Empire's history, the warlords did not argue. They understood. The time for conquest was over. Now, the only thing that mattered was stopping the end of the galaxy. Zalvar Science Vessel, Deep Space Research Lab 17. Dr. Valix had dedicated his life to biological warfare. The Zalvar were masters of it, engineering plagues to cripple enemy worlds, unleashing toxins that turned entire species against each other. But this virus was different. He had been given an infected specimen for study, a former Zalvar soldier. He had dissected it, analyzed its cells, ran every test he could. And what he discovered horrified him. The virus wasn't just a mutation. It wasn't natural. It was engineered. Someone, or something, had designed it. And worse. It was still evolving. Valix turned to his research assistant, his mandibles clicking in distress. "We must inform High Command immediately. This is not a disease." He pointed at the display screen, showing microscopic footage of the infection cells. The virus was moving with purpose, almost intelligent. "This is a weapon." The assistant paled. Who could have created something like this? Valix's fingers trembled over his control panel. "That is the question, isn't it?" Before the assistant could respond, the lights flickered. Then, a metallic screech echoed through the lab. Valix froze. His specimen had been securely restrained. There was no possible way it could escape. And yet, the reinforced containment shattered. The infected soldier, once dead, was now standing. Its body had changed again. It had been learning. Adapting. And now, it was free. As the alarms blared, as the infection broke loose aboard the research station, Valix realized the true horror of what they were facing. It wasn't just spreading. It was getting smarter. The beginning of the end. The Zalvar Empire was on the verge of collapse. The Sarkin Confederacy had fallen. The virus was no longer contained to one species. It had crossed genetic barriers. And worst of all, it wasn't acting randomly. Something had created it. And it had a purpose. As the infected continued to spread, as entire civilizations crumbled, one horrifying question loomed over the galaxy. Who, or what, unleashed this plague? And why? The Zalvar High Command had sent their last, desperate orders across the Empire: find the origin. Stop the infection at all costs. Every remaining fleet scrambled to survive, but one ship, the intelligence vessel Silent Dagger, was given a different mission. Their objective: trace the infection to its source. Aboard the Silent Dagger, Agent Valor Zeiss was no soldier. He was a ghost, a Zalvar operative trained in espionage, assassination, and deep cover intelligence. He had infiltrated enemy governments, stolen technology, and toppled entire civilizations without them realizing it. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for this mission. The virus had spread like wildfire, but every infected world had one common factor: an anomaly on their long-range scans. A strange signal had been detected near a dead star system at the edge of the galaxy. Something was broadcasting it. Something unnatural. Coming out of FTL in 5, 4, 3, the pilot announced. The Silent Dagger emerged into a graveyard of ships. Valor's mandibles tightened. His compound eyes scanned the wreckage. Hundreds of vessels, Zalvar, Sarkin, and dozens of other species, floated in the void, lifeless. Some were ancient, rusted from millennia of decay. Others were fresh, still bearing the scorch marks of recent battles. And in the center of it all was a massive, derelict structure. It wasn't Zalvar. It wasn't Sarkin. It was something else. The ship's sensors flickered as they attempted to analyze it. "Structure is over 800,000 years old," one of the crew whispered. "And it's still broadcasting that signal." Valor narrowed his eyes. "Take us in." The derelict, forbidden tech. The boarding crew moved in silence, weapons drawn. The ship's interior was colossal, its hull stretching endlessly into the darkness. Strange glyphs lined the walls, pulsing faintly. Valor touched one. It was warm. This ship wasn't dead. It was waiting. The deeper they moved, the more unsettling the environment became. The air was thick with whispers, as if the walls themselves were murmuring secrets. Then, they found the chamber. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, hundreds of them. Inside, figures were preserved in a frozen, death-like sleep. Valor's translator struggled to process the alien script, but one phrase appeared repeatedly. The architects of the end. Before he could process the meaning, something stirred. A stasis pod cracked open. The being inside wasn't dead. And it wasn't alive. Its skin was smooth, almost metallic, but pulsing with organic veins. Its eyes glowed with the same energy as the infection's mutations. And then, it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts. Valor's mind was invaded by images, visions of war, destruction, and creation. The architects had built the virus. It had been a weapon. A war machine designed to consume and adapt, to evolve beyond any resistance. It was never meant to spread unchecked. It was meant to be controlled. But something had gone wrong. Something had freed it. The architect's eyes snapped open fully. The ship came to life. And across the galaxy, the infection responded. The virus awakens. On infected worlds, something changed. Hordes of mindless undead stopped moving. They froze in place. Then, as one, they turned their heads. For the first time, their movements were coordinated. They were no longer just spreading. They were waiting. Valor's realization. The architect rose from its stasis pod. Its voice, an echo of countless voices, resonated through the ship. You have woken us. Valor stepped back, his rifle shaking in his grip. What are you? We are the first. The last. The makers of the end. The architect tilted its head, as if studying him. Then it spoke again. The infection was lost. Now, it has found its purpose again. Valor's breath caught in his throat. He turned to his team, his instinct screaming. Get back to the ship. Now. Alarms blared. The silent Dagger's pilot shouted over comms. The infected, everywhere, they're moving. From the planet-sized ship, a pulse erupted, an invisible wave that stretched across the void, touching every infected creature in the galaxy. And suddenly, they weren't just a virus anymore. They were an army. An army that had just received its first order. To finish what they started. The beginning of the final war. The Zalvar had thought they were fighting a mindless plague. They had thought they were battling a biological accident. But now they knew the truth. The architects, the ones who had created the virus, had awakened. And they had taken control. Across the galaxy, infected forces shifted as one. They no longer acted as beasts. They moved like soldiers. Like conquerors. The war was no longer about survival. It was about who would rule the ashes of the galaxy. And humanity? Humanity had yet to make its move. But soon. They would. The holographic war table flickered, projecting a nightmare across the galaxy. Admiral Jonas Wexler of the United Earth Government, UEG, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched as he analyzed the data. Zalvar space was collapsing. Sarkin space was gone. The infection had overrun entire star systems, and now, it was acting with purpose. For years, humanity had remained in the shadows of the great empires, expanding cautiously, avoiding unnecessary wars. But now? Now, they had no choice. This is it, Wexler said. His voice was rough, worn from sleepless nights. The moment we feared. If that plague reaches the Sol system, it's over. Across the table, General Samantha Royce exhaled sharply. Sir, with all due respect, it's already spreading outside the war zone. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when it reaches us. The table displayed an expanding red zone, a line of death creeping toward human space. Humanity's long-held neutrality was over. Then we need to hit them first, Wexler said. Hard. A deep voice rumbled from the side of the room. And how do you suggest we fight something that doesn't die? Commander Gabriel Vasquez, leader of the UEG's elite helljumpers, leaned forward. I've seen the reports. Bullets work, sometimes. Fire works, sometimes. These things keep adapting. Royce narrowed her eyes. So what's your solution, Vasquez? The Marine grinned. Kill them faster than they can evolve. Battle of Outpost Echo 9, humanity's first strike. A lone Zalvar distress signal had reached the UEG, one of the few surviving outposts that hadn't been completely wiped out. Humanity answered. They didn't send diplomats. They sent helljumpers. Orbital drop pods tore through the atmosphere of Echo 9, blazing like meteors as they slammed into the battlefield below. Within seconds, the pods burst open, and humanity's deadliest warriors charged into the chaos. Commander Vasquez led the charge, his power armor whirring as he landed, his Gauss rifle snapping up. The scene before him was a slaughterhouse. Zalvar soldiers, once the feared warriors of the Empire, were being ripped apart by the infected. The enemy moved like a hive mind, faster, stronger, smarter. And yet, the Zalvar were still fighting. A squad of exhausted Zalvar warriors had formed a last stand around a crumbling command center, their weapons overheating as they poured fire into the approaching swarm. Vasquez didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle. Light 'em up. The helljumpers opened fire. Railgun rounds punched through mutated flesh. Incendiary grenades turned the undead into screaming pyres. For the first time, the infected hesitated. They had never fought humans before. Vasquez grinned. Yeah, that's right, ugly. We ain't like the others. A Zalvar commander staggered toward him, his armor blackened with claw marks. His mandibles clicked in disbelief as he stared at the humans. You came to help? Vasquez tossed a thermite charge into an advancing horde, incinerating them. He smirked. Not for you, Bug. We just don't like losing. The first victory, a new alliance. By the time the smoke cleared, Echo 9 still stood. It was the first time anyone had repelled a coordinated infected force. The Zalvar survivors stared at their human rescuers with a mix of shock and respect. Admiral Wexler's face appeared on Vasquez's calm. Good work, Commander, he said. Bring back any survivors that still have their brains intact. We're gonna need them. Vasquez glanced at the Zalvar commander. The once mighty empire was broken, desperate. And for the first time in history, they needed humanity. Vasquez smirked. How's it feel, Bug? He asked. You spent centuries treating us like backwater primitives. And now? We're your best shot at survival. The Zalvar commander exhaled, his mandibles tightening. We will fight alongside you. Vasquez clapped him on the back. Damn right you will. The war turns. The architects had assumed the galaxy was already theirs. They hadn't counted on humanity. The Helljumpers' success at Echo 9 was a turning point. For the first time, the infected had been pushed back. For the first time, the Zalvar had allies. And for the first time, humanity was taking the fight to them. As the UEG mobilized its fleets, as Zalvar warlords pledged their remaining forces to this new coalition, Admiral Wexler gave his final order. Prepare for war. The fight for survival was over. Now, It was time to crush the galactic tyrants. The galaxy had been dying. Now, it was fighting back. The UEG had no intention of playing defense. With the Zalvar remnants at their side, humanity launched a full-scale offensive, not just against the infected, but against the source, the architects themselves. Admiral Jonas Wexler stood on the command deck of the Vengeance, his gaze locked onto the holographic battle map. Red zones marked the infected strongholds. One stood out. The Dead System, home of the architect's derelict ship. It was time to end this. Mission briefing, the last hope. In the war room, Wexler addressed the strike force commanders, battle-hardened veterans, human and Zalvar alike. This war isn't just about survival anymore, he said. His voice was cold, sharp, uncompromising. We've spent too long reacting. Too long on the back foot. He gestured to the map. The architects control the infection. They're the head of the snake. If we kill them, the plague loses its brain. Vasquez, leaning against the wall, smirked. So, what? We knock on their door and say hello with a couple nukes? Wexler gave him a thin smile. Something like that. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. The main fleet would engage the infected armada, drawing their forces away from the Dead System. A strike team, human helljumpers and Zalvar shock troops, would infiltrate the derelict and assassinate the architects. Once the architects were dead, the fleet would obliterate the system with orbital bombardment. It was suicide. And it was their only chance. The Battle of the Dead System, humanity's gamble. The UEG Zalvar fleet arrived at the Dead System to find exactly what they expected. A horde of infected warships, waiting. The enemy had learned. They anticipated an attack. But they hadn't anticipated humanity's ruthlessness. Fire all weapons. Wexler commanded. The void erupted in nuclear fire. Human dreadnoughts punched holes through the enemy lines, while Zalvar warships, once humanity's greatest enemy, fought alongside them, tearing through the infected like a vengeful storm. It was a war humanity wasn't supposed to win. And yet, they were. But the real battle was just beginning. Inside the architect's stronghold, Vasquez's strike team punched through the derelict's hull, breaching into its ancient corridors. The ship was alive, its walls pulsing like a living thing. The whispers had returned. The architects were waiting. The team pushed forward, cutting through infected guardians, their weapons burning the horrors to ash. Then, they reached it. The core chamber. A vast, cathedral-like hall, filled with architects. They stood in rows, their metallic, organic bodies towering over the intruders. Vasquez tightened his grip on his rifle. Well, this is a little worse than I thought. One architect stepped forward. Its voice was not sound. It was in their minds. You cannot stop us. The air changed. The team froze, trapped in some psychic grip. Vasquez fought against it, his mind burning under the pressure. Images flooded his vision. The architects had not created the infection for war. They had created it for something far worse. It was never just a plague. It was a reset. A way to purge the galaxy and start over. They had done this before. Again. And again. And again. Each time, civilizations had risen, and when they became too powerful, the architects released the infection to wipe the slate clean. Humanity had only survived this long because they had been beneath notice. Now, the architects had noticed them. And they had decided to erase them. Vasquez gritted his teeth. Yeah. Well, bad news for you, buddy. He activated his explosive charges. We don't like being erased. The fall of the architects. The first detonations rocked the chamber. The architects reeled, their psychic grip shattering. The strike team opened fire. Armor-piercing rounds shredded the ancient beings. Incendiary grenades turned them to burning husks. And in the center of it all, Vasquez stood, grinning through the carnage. The architects had ruled the stars for 1,000,000 years. And they had never fought humans before. In minutes, it was over. The last architect collapsed, its body smoldering. The team barely had time to exhale before their comms blared. Vasquez. Wexler's voice. Urgent. The fleet is pulling back. We're hitting the system with everything we've got. Vasquez checked the timer on his wrist. 5 minutes. He turned to his team. Hope nobody wanted souvenirs, 'cause this place is about to die. The end of the infection. As the strike team escaped, the fleet launched its final bombardment. Thousands of warheads streaked toward the dead system, their payloads igniting the void in a blinding inferno. The derelict, the infection, the architects themselves. All of it burned. And as the fire consumed the system, the infected across the galaxy collapsed. Their masters were gone. Their control was broken. The war was over. The ashes of empires. Humanity had done the impossible. They had saved the galaxy. But it had come at a cost. The Zalvar Empire was in ruins. The Sarkin were extinct. Entire star systems had been lost forever. Admiral Wexler stood in silence, watching the wreckage float through space. Vasquez stepped up beside him. So, we won, right? Wexler exhaled. Yeah. We won. He turned toward the remnants of the Zalvar leadership. What happens next? One of them asked. Wexler's expression hardened. The old empires are gone. The war is over. His eyes narrowed. Now, we build something better. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was free. The great empires that had once ruled with arrogance were ashes, their arrogance crushed under the weight of their own failures. The Zalvar had been broken but survived. The Sarkin were gone. The architects, the hidden overlords of the galaxy, had been erased. And humanity? Humanity had won. But war never truly ends. Admiral Jonas Wexler stood on a balcony overlooking New Geneva, the beating heart of the United Earth government. Below, the city thrived, humans and alien refugees walking side by side, a scene unimaginable just years ago. A soft footstep behind him signaled the arrival of General Samantha Royce. It's official, she said, handing him a datapad. The first meeting of the Galactic Coalition begins tomorrow. And guess who they want as Supreme Commander? Wexler smirked, barely glancing at the offer. Let me guess. Some Zalvar warlord? No, she said. They want you. He exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. We spent centuries as the underdogs. Now they want us to lead them. Royce nodded. Whether we wanted this or not, we're in charge now. And that was the truth of it. Humanity had not only survived, they had proven themselves superior to every race that had once ruled over them. And now, with the old regimes crumbled, humanity had the power to reshape the galaxy. But Wexler knew power was a dangerous thing. Vasquez's warning, a shadow in victory. Deep in the outer colonies, Commander Gabriel Vasquez sat in a dimly lit bar, his fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey. All around him, soldiers celebrated. Humanity had crushed the architects. The war was over. The galaxy was theirs. But Vasquez? He couldn't shake the unease. He replayed the battle in his mind. The architects had spoken of the infection as a tool, a way to reset civilizations when they grew too powerful. What if they weren't the first ones to use it? What if something else had created the infection before them? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. You don't seem like a man enjoying victory. Vasquez turned. A Zalvar warrior stood there, one of the few survivors from Echo 9. His name was Varka, and despite their past as enemies, Vasquez had come to respect the alien. Vasquez took a sip. Something doesn't feel right. Varka clicked his mandibles. Because you suspect the architects were merely pawns. Vasquez frowned. You think so too? The Zalvar warrior sat down across from him. We were arrogant, human. We saw ourselves as rulers of the galaxy. But we never asked the real question. Vasquez leaned forward. What question? Varka's mandibles tightened. Who ruled before us? Silence. The thought sent a chill down Vasquez's spine. The architects had wiped out countless civilizations, but where had they come from? And why had they failed to maintain their control? Vasquez set his drink down, a grim look settling on his face. You think there's something worse out there? Varka nodded slowly. Yes. And we just announced ourselves to it. The signal. Far beyond known space, on the edge of the galactic rim, a lone probe drifted through the void. It was ancient, built by something far older than the architects. Its purpose had been simple. To wait. To wait for the infection to complete its purpose. To wait for a galaxy ready to be reset once more. But something had gone wrong. The architects were gone. The infection had been defeated. And something new had risen. The probe's systems whirred to life. A message, transmitted in a language no living being could understand, rippled across the void, towards something deep in the abyss of intergalactic space. Something that had not moved in eons. Something that was now awakening. The signal was simple. Error, galactic reset failure. New dominant species detected. Initiating Protocol Omega. And in the endless blackness between galaxies, something stirred. Epilogue, the age of humanity begins. On Earth, Wexler made his decision. The galaxy was too fractured, too weak. If humanity didn't take control, someone else would. And if Vasquez's paranoia was right, if there was something worse out there, then they needed to be stronger than ever. The era of the old empires was over. A new one had begun. And this time, it belonged to humanity. But in the darkness beyond the stars, something was watching. Something that had seen empires rise and fall before. Something that had never lost. Until now. End of story.